Stop! You have no right to hit him like that!" A woman's angry, undisguised scream of desperation rang out, tearing through the tense, stifling atmosphere of a suburban street corner on a gloomy afternoon. The November sky was gray. The heavy clouds seemed to be sinking lower, signaling an impending rain. Immediately after that scream, without a word of warning, without a moment's hesitation from the one holding the power, came a harsh, dry bang, the sound of a gun. An unmistakable sound, a sound that carried death and tragedy, reverberated among the silent rows of houses. A woman, slim but resolute in a well-fitted, elegant black business suit, collapsed onto the rough stone pavement. The black calfskin briefcase she always carried with her fell to the side. The lock burst open. The important papers inside flew out, fluttering in the cold wind, then landed on the wet pavement. Blood. A thick, dark red stream began to spread rapidly from one shoulder, soaking the high-quality silk fabric, forming a strange, gruesome shape on the gray cement of the pavement. She struggled to get up, one hand unconsciously clutching the throbbing, burning wound, her eyes still staring, unwavering, at the policeman who had just coldly opened fire. Disbelief, extreme physical pain, and a burning anger were clearly visible on her delicate face, now pale from blood loss and terrible shock. Her lips pressed tightly together, trying to suppress a groan. Just a few feet away, another black man, his work clothes worn and stained with dirt and mortar, lay curled on the cold ground, his face swollen and bruised, blood oozing from the corner of his mouth and a gash on his forehead. Beside him, two policemen in dark blue uniforms stood. One, a large man with a rough face, a badge on his chest that read Olson, was still panting from the violence he had just committed. His right hand clutched a black Glock pistol that had just been fired, the barrel still warm, a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke lingering on the muzzle. His expression was a strange, indescribable mixture of satisfied animalistic ferocity and a touch of bewilderment, a belated glimmering realization of the terrible, irreversible thing he had just done. He glanced at the fallen woman, then back at his colleague, a flash of confusion in his eyes that were used to looking at life with contempt. What really happened here, leading to this horrific tragedy in the middle of a seemingly peaceful and safe suburban neighborhood? Who was this brave but unfortunate woman, and why did she risk her life to interfere with the police work, only to meet such a tragic end? Was Police Officer Olson really threatened to the point of firing in self-defense, as he may later try to justify? Or was this simply a brutal abuse of power, a deadly loss of control by a man filled with prejudice and hatred? Does justice still exist? And whose side will it be on in this unequal confrontation, filled with blood and tears? Let's listen together and uncover each layer of the heartbreaking truth behind that cruel gunshot. The woman's name was Imani Hayes. At 32, she was a rising star in the legal world, a young talent who had quickly established herself with intelligence, sharpness, and a burning passion for her profession. Imani was currently working in the criminal division of the State Attorney General's office, a position that many people dream of, but not everyone has the ability and courage to take on. It was a Friday at the end of a stressful and tiring work week with stacks of complex case files, tense courtroom sessions, where she had to confront experienced defense attorneys and even demanding judges. She had just left the majestic modern office building in the city center, driving her familiar silver Honda Accord sedan on the busy highway, heading to the cozy little house in the suburbs, where she lived alone but always felt at peace. Imani's mind still lingers with the details of a serious domestic violence case she is handling, and her heart is heavy with an indescribable sorrow for the vulnerable victims, the women and children who have suffered cruelty from their own loved ones. She always tells herself that her job is to bring justice, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. As Imani's car slowly rolled around the corner, where Elm Street and Washington Avenue intersected, near a row of noisy convenience stores and a deserted public park, a sudden sight caught her eye, causing her to jerk and instinctively slam on the brakes. The car came to a sudden stop, the tires screeching loudly on the pavement. Two police officers, one tall and fierce-faced, with an air of superiority, the other younger, thinner, and less aggressive, were restraining a black man. What shocked and enraged Imani to the core was that Officer Olson was using a metal police baton to repeatedly and mercilessly strike the man's back, legs, and anywhere else he could reach. The man didn't seem to be resisting at all, just trying to cover his head with his hands and moan in pain, weak, desperate cries. The black man being savagely beaten was Samuel Green, 45 years old, a gentle, simple, hard-working construction worker. He had just finished his shift after a hard, sweaty day at a construction site a few blocks away. He was walking to the bus stop down the street to go home to his wife and two young children, who were waiting for dinner. He was stopped by the two police officers as he passed the convenience store, with the most vague and unconvincing reason. He looked like a suspect in a petty theft of a few bottles of beer that had occurred there a few minutes earlier. It was an excuse that Officer Olson, who was notorious in the department for bullying and harassing vulnerable people, especially people of color whom he did not like, often used to show off his power and cause trouble. Imani Hayes, with her years of professional instincts and a conscience that would not allow her to ignore injustice, could not stand by and watch the blatant violence and cruelty unfold before her eyes. She quickly pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the engine, removed the key, and took a deep breath to calm her racing heart. She quickly got out of the car and walked toward the scene, trying to keep a safe distance but enough to clearly observe everything happening and be able to intervene if the situation worsened. "What are you doing?" Imani asked loudly, her voice firm, clear, and powerful, trying to drown out Samuel Green's groans of pain and Officer Olson's gasps and puffs of enthusiasm for tormenting another person. "Why did you beat him so badly? Did he have a weapon? Did he resist or threaten your lives in any way?" Officer Olson, in the heat of his unfettered display of authority, whipped his head around at the sound of Imani's voice. His bloodshot eyes stared at her, a look of annoyance and hostility. Sweat trickled down his face, flushed from exertion and anger. "This is none of your business, bitch. Get the hell out of my sight. This is police work, not for nosy civilians to meddle in other people's business." His voice was rough, full of vulgar words. Officer Peterson, Olson's younger colleague, who had his knee pinned down on Samuel Green's back, immobilizing him, stood by, looking slightly confused and surprised by Imani's sudden appearance. However, he made no attempt to intervene in Olson's brutality. He remained silent, head down, a shadowy accomplice, someone who accepted wrongdoing so as not to confront his violent colleague. Imani was unfazed by Olson's rude words and aggressive, threatening demeanor. She stood tall, her feet shoulder-width apart, looking directly into his bloodshot eyes. "I have a right to ask questions, officer," she said, her voice calm and clear, even as her heart pounded in her chest. "I am a citizen of this city, and I am witnessing with my own eyes your use of clearly excessive, even brutal, force against a seemingly defenseless person. This is an abuse of power, a serious violation of police procedure." She calmly pulled her new iPhone from her work jacket pocket, held it high, and pressed the record button. "This will be recorded in full as evidence." Imani's direct confrontation, questioning, and especially her confident filming, seemed to add fuel to the fire of anger that was already burning fiercely in Officer Olson's heart. He felt his authority, a distorted authority that he considered inviolable. was being challenged and publicly humiliated by a woman of color, a bitch that he despised. He let go of Samuel Green, who was now almost unconscious, lying flat, groaning on the cold sidewalk, then aggressively and furiously advanced toward Imani, his heavy, angry footsteps stomping hard on the cement, as if he wanted to crush everything in his way. "Who do you think you are, you sly, gossipy little brat?" Olsen growled, pointing his filthy, coarse finger at Imani, the distance between them now less than an arm's length. His voice was full of contempt and barely concealed racism. "Defending this kind of criminal scum? Or are you one of his accomplices? You're always like that, jumping in to cause trouble and obstruct the police. I know nothing about you, petty lawyers, only good at arguing, defending the filth of society." Imani tried to keep her composure, though a vague fear began to creep in. She knew she was dealing with a dangerous man, someone who might have lost his mind and could do anything in a fit of madness, but she couldn't back down. To back down now would mean accepting injustice, accepting brutality. "I'm documenting your gross abuse of power, Officer Olsen," she said, her voice struggling to remain steady. "You have no right to assault a defenseless person like that, nor do you have any right to threaten or insult me while I'm exercising my citizen's supervision." "Threatening you?" Olsen sneered, a cruel and challenging smile on his twisted face. "I'll show you what a real threat is." He swung his arm violently, trying to snatch the phone from Imani's hand. Imani took a quick step back, her natural instinct to try to protect her phone. It was her only evidence, her only weapon at the moment. "Don't touch me!" she shouted, her voice fierce and unyielding. During the struggle, in a rage that had reached its peak and lost all control, or perhaps it was an intentional act, a punishment that Olsen wanted to teach this talkative black brat a lesson for life. Officer Olsen suddenly let go of the phone, and with a lightning-fast movement, he pulled his service Glock 17 pistol from the holster on his hip. Everything happened so fast, so suddenly, that Imani had no time to react. "You want to fight to the end?" Olsen shouted one last time, his eyes glaring, red like those of a wild animal. And then, without hesitation, without a thought for the consequences, his index finger squeezed the trigger. The gunshot rang out, dry and terrifying, tearing the already tense atmosphere of the evening. The sound was like a fatal stab, cutting into the fake peace of the neighborhood. Imani felt a sharp blow to her left shoulder, as if someone had hit her with a sledgehammer. Then came a sharp pain that went to her bones, spreading throughout her body. Her entire body felt like it had been pushed backwards by an invisible, powerful force. She fell to her knees, then collapsed onto the hard sidewalk. The phone flew from her trembling hand, slid across the cement, and lay still, the screen black. Blood from the gunshot wound began to flow, hot and sticky, staining a patch of her suit and splattered across the sidewalk. Samuel Green, who was in excruciating pain from Olsen's brutal beatings earlier, let out a horrified scream when he saw the horrible, unbelievable scene. Officer Peterson, Olsen's young colleague, who had stood stock still during the confrontation between Olsen and Imani, now stood frozen in place, his face pale as if drained of blood. His eyes were wide open, staring at the smoking gun in Olsen's hand, then down at the woman lying motionless in a pool of blood. He couldn't believe Olsen would dare shoot an unarmed woman who had made no threat, in broad daylight, in front of so many witnesses. Officer Olsen seemed stunned for a few seconds after his own gunshot. He looked at the gun, still smoking lightly in his hand, then back at the woman lying in the growing pool of blood. But then, the self-preservation instinct of a criminal, or perhaps the callousness of someone accustomed to violence, quickly rose up, overwhelming the initial panic. He mumbled something under his breath, incoherent, Meaningless words like, "She brought it on herself," or "She tried to attack me first. I had to defend myself." He began to try to construct a false scenario in his mind to justify his brutal actions. Residents of nearby apartments, who had initially watched from their windows or balconies, now began to crowd closer, unable to keep quiet. Some screamed in horror, pointing at Olsen. Others, who had remained calm, rushed to their phones to call 911, reporting the shooting and requesting an ambulance. The atmosphere became chaotic, tense, and angry. Whispers and curses began to rise. Officer Peterson seemed to wake up from a terrible nightmare. He was shaking, fumbling to pull out the walkie-talkie on his hip, and in a stuttering, inarticulate voice, he reported to the police station's command center. There was a shooting. Officer involved. Someone seriously injured. Ambulance and backup requested immediately. At the scene at the corner of Elm and Washington Avenue. He glanced at Olsen, his eyes filled with fear and contempt. Imani lay there, in a cold pool of blood. Her physical pain was tormenting her every second, but her mind was still trying incredibly hard to stay conscious. She looked straight into Olsen's face, distorted by anger and now a little panic. Her eyes were no longer filled with surprise or fear, but with an extreme indignation, a fierce will to survive, and an unshakable determination. She knew she had to live. She had to live to expose this horrifying truth, to demand justice for herself, and for the innocent man Samuel Green, and for other nameless victims of those who abused their power. Those who disguised themselves as law enforcement officers to trample on the dignity and lives of others, like Officer Olsen. The ambulance, its siren blaring and its emergency lights flashing, tore apart the fake silence of the neighborhood and arrived very quickly. Imani was carefully treated by the emergency medical staff on the spot and was quickly loaded into the ambulance, which rushed straight to the nearest central hospital. The gunshot wound to her left shoulder was very severe, causing a lot of blood loss and severe damage to her muscles and nerves. But fortunately, the bullet did not hit any vital organs such as her heart or lungs, and did not pose a direct threat to her life. After a complicated surgery that lasted nearly 3 hours, the talented doctors successfully removed the bullet from her shoulder and proceeded to suture the wounds. In the intensive care unit, as the strong painkillers began to take effect, somewhat alleviating the terrible physical pain. The image of Officer Mark Olsen with a cold gun pointed straight at her, his face full of malice, cruelty, kept appearing in Imani's mind. It haunted her even in her short, fitful sleeps, causing her to wake up many times with a start, her back soaked in sweat. But beyond the fear or physical pain, there was a fire of anger and an iron determination to demand justice burning more and more fiercely in her heart. She was a lawyer, and she would never let injustice win. That same evening, when Imani had just regained some consciousness after the surgery and the anesthesia, 2 plainclothes investigators from the Internal Investigation Bureau, IAB, of the Metropolitan Police Department arrived at the hospital. They came to take her initial statement about the shooting, although still very tired, weak and in pain. Imani, with the courage and professionalism of an experienced lawyer, tried to concentrate her mind, recounting the entire incident clearly, distinctly, logically, without leaving out any important details. From the moment she witnessed Samuel Green being beaten until the moment the bullet hit her shoulder. As the 2 IAB investigators were busy taking notes on Imani's statement, trying to maintain an objective attitude but unable to hide their tension, the door to the comfortable but cold hospital room suddenly opened. A man in his 50s, wearing a smart charcoal gray business suit, his gray hair neatly combed, his face stern but showing obvious anxiety and unconcealed anger, quickly walked into the room. It was Mr. David Sterling, the chief of the criminal division of the state attorney general's office, Imani's direct boss, mentor, and someone whom she had greatly respected and admired during her years working there. Mr. Sterling had received an urgent message from a close colleague of Imani's in the office, who had tried to contact her all afternoon without success, and then heard from a source in the police department about a shooting in which the victim was a black woman, a lawyer, with identifying characteristics very similar to Imani. "Imani, oh my God! Are you okay? Are you seriously hurt? Mr. Sterling exclaimed, his voice filled with horror, worry, and even anger as he saw his favorite student, one of his most brilliant lawyers, lying on the hospital bed, her shoulder bandaged in white, her face pale and weak. The two IAB investigators stood up reflexively when they saw the sudden appearance of an important and powerful figure like the chief of the criminal division of the state attorney general's office. They were stunned, looked at each other in confusion, and began to feel that something was really wrong. An invisible pressure was weighing down on their shoulders. Imani managed a weak smile, though the movement made the wound in her shoulder sting. "I'm fine. Chief Sterling, still alive," she said, her voice laced with bitter sarcasm. "Just got caught in a stray police bullet while trying to do a good deed." Mr. Sterling paid no attention to Imani's words. He turned sharply to the two IAB investigators, his eyes now as sharp as knives, his voice full of authority and undeniable. "The victim you are interviewing is attorney Imani Hayes, one of the finest, most dedicated, and most honorable attorneys in the state attorney general's office. I want to know exactly, without missing a single detail, what the hell happened here this afternoon, and why. I repeat, why. Would one of your police officers open fire on a citizen, a state attorney, when she was completely unarmed and trying to stop another act of violence by your own?" The information that Imani Hayes was a senior attorney in the state attorney general's office, an agency with the power to monitor and investigate the activities of law enforcement agencies, including the police department, was like a time bomb that had just exploded. It was quickly reported urgently by two IAB investigators to Officer Olson's direct superiors and the entire top leadership of the city's police department. As for Officer Mark Olson, after being taken to police headquarters to give a statement and having his weapons temporarily confiscated, he initially remained stubborn. He tried to fabricate a plausible story, that he acted according to procedure, that he felt his life was in serious danger because of the woman's aggressive attitude and assault behavior, and that Imani had violently obstructed an officer in the performance of his duties. He had no idea who the victim he had just coldly shot was, and how important and sensitive his position was in the justice system. When a deputy sheriff, who was in charge of internal affairs, with a face pale with worry and anger, directly informed Olson that the man he had just fatally wounded was Attorney General Imani Hayes. Olson's face, which was full of false confidence, slowly changed color. His usual aggressiveness and arrogance disappeared without a trace, replaced by a look of utter confusion, fear, and anxiety. His eyes widened, staring at his superior, his mouth stammering. Cold sweat began to break out on his forehead and stream down his temples. He really knew, that he had caused an irreparable disaster, a fatal mistake that would ruin his entire career and perhaps his life. The city's police department leadership immediately recognized the extremely serious, complex, and sensitive nature of the incident. This was no longer just another officer-involved shooting in the line of duty, but a potentially major scandal, a potential assault, or at least serious injury, on an elite member of the state's judiciary, an agency with the power to investigate and prosecute itself. The consequences would be dire, not only for Officer Olson personally, but for the reputation and image of the entire police department. A media and legal crisis was looming. The legal battle, a relentless fight for justice, began almost immediately after Imani was released from critical condition. Imani's cell phone, although thrown out and with a few cracks on the screen, was still intact, and fortunately, the short but crucial video she had taken before she was shot was still on its memory. While it only captured a portion of the events before the fatal shot rang out, it clearly captured Officer Olsen's aggressive, disparaging, and racist rhetoric, as well as the moment he aggressively approached her, violently trying to snatch the phone away. Samuel Green, the innocent black man who had been brutally beaten by Olsen earlier, was taken to the hospital to be treated for serious injuries to his head, back, and legs. His testimony, detailing how he had been stopped by Olsen and Peterson for no reason, beaten by Olsen without resistance, and then witnessed Imani Hayes being shot by Olsen when she tried to intervene to protect him, matched what Imani told investigators. Several residents of nearby apartments, who witnessed part or all of the incident from their windows or balconies, also bravely came forward to testify, providing valuable testimony to the investigating agency. They described in great detail Officer Olsen's violent, out-of-control behavior toward Samuel Green, and then his aggressive, threatening attitude toward attorney Imani Hayes before the terrifying gunshot rang out. The State Attorney General's office, under the direct and decisive direction of Mr. David Sterling, promptly issued an official press release strongly condemning the excessive use of force and signs of abuse of power by the police officer in this incident. At the same time, they also announced that they will directly and closely monitor the investigation by the IAB Internal Investigation Department and the City Police Department to ensure objectivity, transparency, and fairness. The Attorney General's office also does not rule out the possibility of conducting a parallel independent investigation if it finds any signs of cover-up, tolerance, or falsification of case records by the police department. Despite her severe injuries and the painful recovery process, both physically and mentally, with persistent pain, grueling physical therapy sessions, and lasting psychological trauma, Imani Hayes has no intention of backing down or giving up. With the dedicated and professional support of her colleagues at the Attorney General's office and a team of top private defense attorneys in the state, appointed by the Attorney General's office to ensure her best interests in this case, Imani is determined to pursue this case to the end, not only to seek justice for herself, but also to create an important legal precedent, a strong warning to other abusers hiding in the ranks of law enforcement. She is not simply a victim in this case, but she is also an experienced lawyer, a warrior on the legal front, who understands every loophole in the law, every complicated procedural process, and especially the fatal weaknesses, the inexplicable contradictions in Officer Olsen's testimony full of fabrications and denials. As soon as her health allowed, although she still had to sit in a wheelchair or use crutches to move, Attorney Imani Hayes decided to appear before a large group of media at a press conference held at the Attorney General's office. With a calm, confident expression, but a determined gaze and without a trace of fear, she told her entire heartbreaking story clearly and firmly, without any exaggeration or embellishment. She mercilessly exposed the abuse of power, racism, and brutality of Officer Mark Olsen. At the same time, she also strongly called for a comprehensive, transparent, and fair investigation by the authorities, not only into Olsen personally, but also into the systemic problems in the supervision and disciplinary work of the police department. Her words, accompanied by heartbreaking pictures of her injuries and the release of irrefutable evidence, have created a wave of outrage and support across the country. Prestigious civil rights organizations, bar associations across the country, and ordinary citizens have spoken out in unison, expressing deep indignation and demanding that the city police department and relevant agencies handle the case in the most serious manner. Without any cover-up or tolerance for Officer Olsen's misconduct, public pressure is mounting. The state governor must also speak out publicly. pledging to the people that he will ensure a fair and objective investigation and that there will be no interference from any side in the proceedings. Officer Peterson. Olson's young colleague, who was present at the scene and witnessed the whole thing, initially tried to give a favorable testimony for Olson, or at least try to minimize his responsibility, perhaps out of fear of retaliation or a bit of twisted colleague love. But under increasing pressure from public opinion, from the investigative agencies, and especially before the undeniable evidence from the video recorded by Imani and the consistent testimony of other witnesses, Peterson's conscience finally rose. He had to admit the harsh truth. Olson had completely overreacted, had completely lost control, and had not followed any procedures for the use of force in that situation. Peterson's testimony, albeit belated, became one of the final fatal blows, collapsing all of Officer Olson's efforts to defend and deny his guilt. Officer Mark Olson was immediately suspended from duty after the incident and the identity of the victim was determined. Several weeks later, after the preliminary investigation by the IAB and the Attorney General's office had gathered sufficient evidence, the District Attorney's office, under close supervision and considerable pressure from the State Attorney General's office, officially decided to file criminal charges against Mark Olson on a series of serious charges, including first-degree assault with a dangerous weapon, abuse of public power while performing official duties, and intentional infliction of serious bodily injury resulting in permanent damage to the victim's health. Olson's work record was also thoroughly and in detail dug up. The investigation results showed that, not surprisingly, he had been complained about by citizens at least 3 times in the past for using excessive force and using racist words when interacting with people. However, for unknown reasons, all of these complaints were either lightly dismissed or drowned in silence without any appropriate form of discipline being applied. This shows a serious gap in the police department's supervision and handling of violations. In parallel with the criminal case being urgently carried out by the prosecution agencies, Attorney Imani Hayes, with the advice and support of her team of leading lawyers, has also officially filed a civil lawsuit for compensation for damages against Officer Mark Olson personally and the City Police Department as the managing unit, jointly responsible for the misconduct of its employees while performing official duties. The lawsuit requests compensation for the severe physical damages that Imani suffered, including the cost of surgery, inpatient and outpatient treatment, rehabilitation costs lasting for months, even years. Severe mental losses, severe psychological shock, terrifying obsession after the incident, decline in quality of life and psychological sequelae that can last a lifetime, and significant losses in income due to her being unable to continue her work for a long time. The total amount of compensation sought in the lawsuit is in the millions of dollars. The criminal trial of former Officer Mark Olson took place months later amid intense national and international media attention, as well as widespread public interest. Olson's defense team, despite knowing that their client was in a weak position and had little chance of escaping, attempted to make mitigating arguments, attempting to paint a picture that Olson acted under extreme emotional stress, that he felt threatened by Imani Hayes's provocative and uncooperative behavior. However, faced with the undeniable evidence from the video recorded by Imani himself, the convincing, logical, and consistent testimony of attorney Imani Hayes, who had to endure the pain to directly confront him in court, of the victim Samuel Green, of the witnesses present at the scene, and especially the late but extremely important confession of former Officer Peterson, all of those defense efforts became weak, unconvincing, and were ultimately unanimously rejected by the jury of 12 people, after many days of intense deliberation. After many days of trial with heated debates between the prosecution and the defense, along with a lengthy and thoughtful deliberation process, the jury reached a final verdict. Mark Olson was found guilty of all the main charges brought by the prosecutor's office. At the sentencing hearing held a week later, in a courtroom packed with attendees and reporters, the presiding judge, after carefully reviewing the entire case file, assessing the brutal, unjustified, and unacceptable nature of the crime, the blatant abuse of the public power entrusted to him by the defendant, and the serious, long-term consequences that Olson had caused to the victim both physically and mentally, issued a severe, highly deterrent sentence. Former police officer Mark Olson was sentenced to 12 years in prison, a sentence that was considered appropriate and fair by public opinion at home and abroad, reflecting the seriousness of the crime and also a strong warning to those who are and will be intending to abuse power and trample on the law. With regard to the civil lawsuit for damages, faced with the very real risk of a further adverse judgment in court after Olson had already been convicted of a crime, and the unforeseeable damage to the city's image and reputation if the lawsuit continued to drag on, the City Council, after numerous meetings and consultations with legal experts, decided to negotiate and reach a settlement agreement with attorney Imani Hayes. Under the agreement, the city agreed to pay Imani Hayes $1.2 million in compensation. Immediately after receiving this compensation, attorney Imani Hayes publicly announced to the press that she would use a significant portion of that amount, about $500,000, to establish a nonprofit legal aid fund called Justice for Imani, which specializes in providing free help and defense to victims of police violence, abuse of public power, especially those from disadvantaged minority communities and those who do not have enough financial means to access justice. Her action has received enthusiastic applause and support from the community. The case of attorney Imani Hayes has truly become a significant turning point, an unforgettable highlight in the long and arduous struggle for social justice and judicial reform locally and nationally. It has led to extensive public debate and, ultimately, significant, positive changes in the city police department's use of force policy, internal oversight procedures, and complaint handling practices, mandatory training programs on anti-racism, communication skills, and de-escalation in confrontational situations, as well as regulations on respecting civil rights, have been strengthened and widely implemented throughout the police force. Imani Hayes, after a difficult recovery, both physically and mentally, with scars that will stay with her for the rest of her life, has returned to the work she loves and is passionate about at the State Attorney General's office. The long scar on her left shoulder will forever be a painful reminder of what happened, of the price she paid for her courage, but it has not broken her or made her lose faith. On the contrary, it has only strengthened her iron will and determination in pursuing her career of protecting justice, protecting the vulnerable. She has become a symbol of courage, resilience, and the relentless fight against injustice, violence, and abuse of power. Her story has inspired many people. The lesson learned from the heartbreaking yet inspiring and hopeful story of attorney Imani Hayes is profound and meaningful. Justice may come late, may have to be paid at a very high price, sometimes with blood and tears, but it is always worth fighting for and pursuing to the end. An ordinary person, with conscience, courage, and understanding of the law, regardless of their position in society, can make a difference, can challenge a system that seems inviolable, and no one, including those entrusted with the responsibility of enforcing the law, is allowed to stand above the law or deprive others of their right to life, the right to safety, and the right to fair treatment, just because of personal prejudices, blind hatred, or the corruption of power. The fight for a more just, civilized, and humane society is still long, and each of us has a role, a responsibility in that fight. What do you think about the 12-year prison sentence and $2 million in damages awarded in the case of Officer Olson and attorney Imani Hayes? Are those punishments really enough to compensate for the severe physical and mental damage that Imani Hayes has suffered? And are they enough to deter similar acts in the future? If you happen to witness an incident similar to what Imani saw, an act of violence and injustice clearly taking place before your eyes, would you be brave enough to intervene, to speak up, knowing that it could bring danger to yourself? What would be your choice? How has this story changed your perception of the role and responsibility of each citizen in monitoring the activities of public agencies and in demanding transparency and accountability from them to build a better society?